Welcome to round 2 of the Maritime Open. So in case you missed it, I shot a video about round 1 where I was playing against a bit of a lower rated opponent than me and managed to win with the black pieces. And now I am against a much higher rated opponent than me, and so this game was very interesting. Let's dive in. So I was playing with the white pieces for this round. I played e4, and my opponent played the Pirc Defense, or the Pirc, as some people call it. The Pirc Defense, which I'm not sure I've ever actually played against the Pircs in a classical tournament, actually. I used to play the Pircs myself as white quite a lot, and have since moved on to the Caro Kann, but I still really like the Pircs. But anyway, I don't know a lot of the theory against it as white because I just don't face it that much, so I've never really studied it deeply. From the white side, anyway. But I do have a setup that I like. I, do kind of the main line up to here, and then I play f4, which is known as the Austrian Attack. And part of the reason I chose the Austrian Attack is because it's a variation that when I play the Pircs as black, I really don't like facing the Austrian Attack. I just feel like it's pretty sharp. It's pretty like one of the things with the Pircs is black often wants to push e5 to try to kind of fight back for the center after kind of conceding the center at the beginning of the game. That's kind of one of the things with these sorts of openings. And f4 really helps to prevent that. Also, I find myself as white, I tend to enjoy openings where the e4 and f4 pawns come out. Like, you have to worry a little bit about this dark square diagonal, as we'll see in this game, actually. But I like developing my knight behind the f-pawn, castling short, and then potentially having an open f-file at some point for my rook. So it just makes something like the Austrian Attack work well for kind of my preferred style of play, I guess. Anyway, so black went ahead with the fianchetto. We did some pretty normal looking moves. In some lines, maybe there's this option of putting the queen on d2, castling long, pushing f5, trying to trade off this dark squared bishop, and then doing some kind of pawn storm, some sort of attack on the king side. So I like to sort of develop this bishop first. But then, yes, the main idea, and I think the best idea for black against this sort of setup is to expand on the queen side, actually. And that's what my opponent did right away with c5. Now, I feel like I've seen lines with the Austrian Attack where this kind of setup happens. And I thought really hard about this move. I didn't play this. I didn't push e5, but I considered it. And I wasn't sure if this was better or not. It doesn't look better, and I don't think it is better in this position. I just kind of remembered this from some of my study as black, but I think maybe it's more along the lines of, like, in an earlier position, white pushes e5 earlier, and then you can strike back with c5 at that point. So I think it's better for black if I push e5. So instead, I captured, and it looks like this is winning a pawn, but I figured my opponent was strong enough that there was something else that they had going on, and indeed they did. They moved their queen to a5, which pins this knight, and this is pretty thematic in the Pircs, especially the I think it's called the Czech variation. I may be wrong about that, but it's a variation where the c pawn gets pushed pretty early, and this queen comes out, the knight gets pinned, and now this pawn is hanging. So I developed my bishop. I could have maybe captured again. I didn't really, excuse me, I didn't really like the idea of my e-pawn falling, but I think maybe it is perfectly fine for me to take there and allow that pawn to fall and then continue from here. But I just went ahead and defended, and they captured on c5. So I castled, they developed their knight, and then I played queen e1. So I recently learned the Grand Prix attack against the Sicilian, and actually I have another video on kind of the basic ideas of that. If you're interested, I'll leave a link down below. And I was kind of thinking that in this position, it looks a little bit like the Grand Prix attack. I have the E and F pawns pushed, the C pawn is pushed over here, and maybe I can launch sort of the thematic kingside attack, which would look like putting the queen over here on h4, pushing f5, and then basically trying to bring my bishop, bring my knight, trade off all of the defenders, and checkmate the king. Which, you know, against someone who's rated 1883, I wasn't expecting that he would allow me to do all of this, but these are maybe some interesting threats. And so I went ahead and put the queen on e1. And this is an interesting point in the game because I feel like my development is really good right now. Maybe even a little bit better than than my opponent's development. Like this bishop is still on the home row. It can come out probably pretty easily, but it was interesting to see during the game what happened over the next few moves, actually. So probably at some point I should have played h3 in order to strengthen this g4 square, but I hadn't, and my opponent punished me for it. So first of all, they played knight g4. It's worth mentioning back here, another potential idea is to put the queen here on d2, which opens up this diagonal and this potential trade of the dark squared bishops. But I didn't like that because I figured if knight g4, in this case, my bishop is going to get traded off. My bishop has nowhere that it can go. And so that was part of the reason why I played queen e1 instead, so that when the knight comes, I can move this bishop back. And I thought, you know, maybe this discovered attack at some point would be helpful. Then my opponent played c4, and this was totally unexpected. I didn't consider this move whatsoever. At first glance, it looks like it just gives up this pawn for nothing. But of course it doesn't, because of these dark squares that I mentioned earlier. So if I take this pawn, then it's a check and I lose my bishop, which I saw pretty quickly after they pushed that pawn, but I didn't see it before this move was actually played. So not much better than to just move the bishop back, and then they move the queen over here anyway with this check. So I move over to h1, and then they push b5. And this is the point where I was like, wait a minute. I just felt really good about my development and about my piece activity a minute ago. And now I have my bishops on the second rank. He has his queen sort of causing problems, causing pressure around my king. This knight is on my half of the board, controlling a bunch of squares. What happened? Like my development was so good and my activity was so good, and now theirs just seems so much better. It seems like the tables have turned. And it was interesting to realize this during the game, and partly I was kind of interested. I was like, this will be interesting to look at and see sort of how they did it. But also, it kind of made me realize that I needed to change my plan a little bit in this game, because I had been thinking, as I mentioned, about trying for this sort of kingside attack, sort of like the Grand Prix. And then at this point, I realized that that's no longer in the cards, not right now anyway. What I need to do is I need to break out of this and try to get better activity for all of my pieces. And so that's what I started to work on, and it actually went really well. Now, in this position, one thing I was always worried about, I guess back here, I was worried about this knight e3 move. And the reason is it potentially has a fork right there on c2. And I didn't really like the idea of trading off my dark squared bishop. I thought that my dark squared bishop was strong, and trading it off meant that their dark squared bishop was going to be very strong. Now in this case, like technically I win a pawn, and then, you know, we do this, but then after that exchange, I guess, you know, they lose their dark squared bishop, which is not great for them, but now my pawn structure is just terrible on the queen side. And so I was a little bit worried about all of that happening. As it turns out, if the knight comes here, I actually have queen f2, which I didn't even consider, but this pins the knight to the queen. If the knight moves anywhere, then black loses their queen. And yeah, like this is not something that I even considered until I was analyzing this with a friend a little earlier today. For some reason, this idea of my queen pinning a piece to something that isn't the king. Like my brain just doesn't go there naturally. You know what I mean? And so this is pretty instructive that you know, if that knight had came there, then being able to pin it with my queen. It's just interesting. It's instructive. It's interesting that I didn't even begin to consider that during the game. Anyway, so I moved this rook over because I was seeing a lot of lines where this knight wanted to move somewhere and I didn't want that bishop to win my pawn. So just did that as kind of a prophylactic move. They finally developed their bishop on a very nice square. And now this move I'm really proud of. This is where I started to put into action what I said earlier, where I need to make my pieces more active somehow. I need to get out of this sort of crunched position that my opponent put me in and make my pieces active. Moving the knight up here both puts the knight on a very active square, but also does so with a tempo, because now I'm attacking black's knight. And again, this is where I was expecting black to put their knight right there, but I still just have this queen f2 move, which is interesting. And so black just simply retreated. And I thought that this was not the right move, because now not only is this knight more active, but now I can push my e-pawn and attack this knight. It needs to move, and then this bishop is much worse now with these pawns in the way. And so my opponent moved back to e8, which I also wasn't expecting. I think I was thinking that they would move here, but in any case, they went back to e8. I think maybe targeting that square perhaps in the future. But now I can break this bishop out, and it sort of restricts the movement of this knight because that bishop is undefended behind it. So if they, I don't know, if they were to move the knight out here or here or something like this, then they would lose their bishop. So he ended up moving the knight back to the home row as well, which defends this bishop, of course. And then I was able to bring this bishop back up to e3 with a tempo on the queen. Now, interestingly, the computer finds a very interesting tactic here, and I'll leave this one for you to leave in the comments below. If you can find the right tactic that that gives a really good sort of kingside attack. My only hint is it has to do with that bishop capturing. So what's the follow-up? Leave a comment below if you can find what the right tactic is here. But I didn't see it during the game. I played bishop there, and what I was seeing is there aren't a lot of squares that this queen can move to, which maintains defense of this pawn. And in fact, the queen did not maintain defense of this pawn. The queen moved all the way back, and so now look how many pieces are on the home row for black, and the only pieces not on the home row are on the 7th rank, although this is a pretty strong bishop, to be fair. Anyway, so I went ahead and grabbed this pawn. Now, there was a better option here, which again, until I was analyzing with a friend, I didn't see this. The better option would have been knight d5, and I didn't consider knight d5 during the game. I just figured, free pawn, let's take it, right? But I think what I missed was how weak this e-pawn was. The e-pawn is sitting there with so many of black's pieces all around it. It looks like it can't possibly be weak, but it is. There is nothing defending that pawn. And plus, that square, of course, is a knight fork on the king and the queen. And so putting the knight there, like, black kind of has nothing better than to trade off their really good light squared bishop for that knight. Which, positionally, at least according to the engine, that would have actually been better than just winning this pawn, which is pretty interesting, pretty instructional. But I did not do that. I saw a free pawn, so I grabbed the free pawn. But things are still good. Like this was still a good move, and I was considering probably moving the pawn back here to d4 at some point. So black kicks this knight out and then attacks this knight. And here, this is where I really should have just moved that knight back. That was kind of the plan all along anyway. But instead, I decided maybe I can get clever. I can get clever by putting the queen here, which attacks this pawn and puts pressure here. Now at this point, somehow I finally realized that this pawn is fairly weak, which I obviously hadn't seen earlier, but I thought I could sort of put some pressure here. The problem is this brings my queen out to a place where it can be a little more easily attacked. And so black played this move, bishop takes e4. And as soon as he played that, I realized this is the plan. Putting the rook over here on the b file, pinning this knight. And when I first saw that, I was like, the game is lost. There, I've made a mistake. I'm playing against, an 1883 rated opponent. I was going to make a mistake at some point and they were going to jump on it, right? So there's nothing to be done. But that isn't true. And I took a careful look and found the continuation that holds the game for white. So I recaptured the rook comes over to b8. And then I made this move, rook b to d1. And I think rook f to d1 also works maybe, and it's in some ways it's better, in some ways it's not. But the idea is once this queen moves, now this knight is weak. Of course, this rook also has to move, but this is exactly what happened. Queen takes, and then I traded and captured that knight. And of course, I lose that pawn, but in this case, it still feels like I'm holding the game. And actually, white is still better here, which is interesting because I have the bishop pair, and they're centralized and active, and I have a lot that I can do. Just moving back a little bit, it may have even been better not to trade queens here. Let me just pull this up. No, trading queens is best. I could capture here, but now it is, as you can see from the eval, now it is it's 0.0. So if capturing the queen actually maintains some advantage for white. So that's what we did. Captured the queen, captured that pawn. And then I played this move, rook a1. I wasn't really happy about this move because I felt like it was passive. I considered, so this pawn is defended, but this pawn is not, right? So I considered maybe moving this up here, but then I just thought that looks terrible. This rook just holding some kind of pressure on both of those pawns. It turns out that rook d7 was the best move here because now I'm attacking both of these pawns, and even if rook takes here and it's defending this pawn, I still have the bishop and my rook hitting the a pawn. Plus, I can just pick up that pawn pretty easily. So it just felt like I didn't want to lose this pawn, but I didn't realize that putting the rook there means that I wouldn't be losing a pawn, I would be trading pawns. I would be able to win a pawn after my a pawn was dropped. So I played rook a1, which again at this point I'm not super happy with it, but it is what it is. Oh, the other thing about playing this move, playing rook d7, is it means that this knight has nowhere to go. And so sometimes it's useful just to play a move that just completely restricts your opponent's options. And that would have been a pretty nice thing to do as well. So I didn't do that, and they brought their knight out. And then at this point, I played rook d7, now finally seeing that I can put pressure on these pawns. And I also realized that if the knight goes to b5, which is what happened, I could just play a4 and kick that knight away right away. When I was analyzing this game with my opponent afterward, he said that when he was evaluating this line, he just totally missed that a4 could happen, and that was quite a strong move. So he played knight c3, but I was ready for this as well, putting the bishop here and pinning that knight. And really, black doesn't have anything better than to force a rook trade, and so that's what we did. And so this is a pretty critical position where white is so much better. My bishops are so active, and my rook as well. Black's bishop is terrible, black's rook is pretty terrible, and black's knight is way like on the rim, almost in the corner, right? And what I really should have done is won this pawn. And the reason I should have won this pawn is because then my a pawn is an outside passed pawn. And an outside passed pawn is a really big asset in the endgame, and that's totally what I should have done. For some reason during the game, I didn't do that. I'm not sure what exactly I was seeing. I don't really remember why I wasn't taking that pawn. I think maybe I was seeing, like, if the rook is over here, then there's maybe something here, but that doesn't even make any sense, actually. Like, maybe I thought, like, if I take with the bishop, then the rook could go over here, which it can't because my other bishop is covering that corner. So I took this pawn instead, and I was a little bit worried that I might be getting a bit greedy, and I kind of regretted it immediately because now suddenly my opponent could put their rook on the d file, and that rook is now quite active. Plus, it's with a tempo because I need to move this bishop. And now, this is where I made a pretty dumb mistake, actually. So the thing is, the bishop has to stay on this diagonal because otherwise, rook d1 is just checkmate. I have to make sure that I don't get checkmated here. But this bishop has to move because it's under attack. I suppose, actually, I could have maybe done that. No, I think not, because I think there's a tactic with takes, and then check, block, takes with checkmate. Anyway, so I decided to move the bishop here because that stays on this diagonal so that I can block the checkmate threat and gets the bishop out of danger. What I should have done, again, is just taken that darn a pawn because my bishop is still on the diagonal. Like, I think somehow I felt like I couldn't do something like take a pawn because I had to worry about this checkmate threat, right? But I can actually, fulfill both objectives. I can take that pawn and it still covers the checkmate threat because the bishop can always still come back to g1. It's still on that diagonal. And so that would have been a really great move. I wish I had found it. I did not find it. I moved the bishop here instead. And now black found this really nice move, knight c3, which both hits this bishop and hits this pawn. And the problem is I can't actually put my bishop here to defend the pawn because now, after check with the rook and bringing the bishop back, the knight has e2, and this bishop is going to fall. So I realized that, and I did not play bishop here. Instead, I played bishop to f3. And one nice thing is that this actually covers the d3 square, or the d1 square, so that the rook can't infiltrate quite as easily. But I totally had some good chances to win that pawn, and I didn't. So knight takes a4 was played, and now finally, I take the a pawn, but now it's not nearly as strong because I don't have an a pawn to be an outside passer. So at this point, it's looking like a draw. Like, technically, according to the engine, white is still winning here, but it seems like one of those cases where white is only winning if white plays like really, really accurately. For a non-computer player at this point, it's looking pretty drawish. So knight b2 to cover this pawn. h3 finally giving my king somewhere to go so I don't have to worry about back rank issues. Bishop f8, just trying to make the bishop more active. And now I start trying to put pressure here. I want to win that pawn to create a passer. But it's kind of too little too late. So black plays h5, which I didn't really realize how strong that was. One thing that allows is for the bishop to come to h6, which actually can put pressure on this backwards pawn, which we'll see in a minute. I'm putting more pressure here, which I felt was pretty good. And then black kind of counterattacks this bishop. And I decided to go ahead and trade here. My logic was that I am up a pawn, so it probably doesn't hurt to try to trade down material a little bit. And also, I had been kind of looking out for an opportunity to trade my light squared bishop for this knight. If I had traded my dark squared bishop for this knight, then we would have ended up in an opposite colored bishop endgame, and I know that those are tend to be pretty drawish, and I thought at least if I had a same color bishop endgame here, then maybe I have better winning chances. I think in the end, it probably would have been better to leave this bishop on the board because I think I might have had better chances that way, but I didn't. I traded it off, moved the king, and then my bishop got attacked. And I knew that that was going to happen. I'd calculated that, but I figured that I always had a few places sort of along this diagonal that I could put it. Of course, I can't go here or here because then rook e2 is going to attack the bishop again and then win my c-pawn, which I really don't want. I don't want black to have a passed pawn. And so then I made probably the worst move I could have made with the bishop, which I like, to be fair, I don't know that this would have been easy, would have been possible for me to see sort of at my level. Like maybe I could have seen it, but this is one of those examples where, like, according to the computer, white still had a chance, except that this random move with the bishop gets rid of all of my chances. I would have maintained my chances by putting the bishop here. And this may be findable, actually. I was worried about this backwards pawn, but now if the rook comes up here, first of all, it is no longer defending this pawn because the bishop is in the way. It is attacking this one, but if I just play c3, then this is the right setup. This is a good setup for white. This pawn will fall, but then so will this one. And now I have a fairly advanced e-pawn and a passer on the c-file. And this would still be, this is winning for white. This is a good position for white. So, but yeah, I didn't see that for whatever reason. I think it just, it looked like the bishop would be kind of loose there. I didn't consider also moving the c-pawn to c3. So I went here thinking, let's just trade off more material. And I was seeing that the rook could come up to e4, but I figured I could always just defend it with my king, right? Until bishop h6. And now this pawn is, I can't defend it. And I thought for quite a while to try to figure out what to do here. And I decided that, I was looking at like what happens if I deliver a check with the rook. And I realized that if I deliver a check with the rook and they move to h7, then I can always come back and hit this pawn. And then maybe they have to go back to g8. And so there's a potential repetition of moves here. We were both getting a little bit low on the clock, and for me, I was playing against, again, a much higher rated opponent, so I thought about it for a while, and then I figured, you know what, let's try for a repetition of moves, let's go for a draw, and that's exactly what we did. So I think there would have been an opportunity for them in this sort of position to move to g7 instead, and the game would have continued on, and I'm not sure how it would have gone. Like maybe I would have been able to defend here and make a draw still, but maybe not. But in any case, that's not what we did. We ended up drawing the game, and I was quite happy with that. I felt like I definitely was winning and then sort of misplayed it so that I could have had a win but didn't get it. There were a couple of big issues. One was the queen b4 move with the knight on this square and allowing for the tactic with the rook pinning. That wasn't like the end of the world, and especially since I had this rook move that targeted the knight on the other side of the board. But it was a problem, and I feel like when I made that queen move, let me just reset the board back there. Where is it here? Move, yeah, 21. Here it is. I felt like it didn't feel right. Like it felt like the queen was just kind of misplaced there, and there were too many opportunities for counterplay. But I couldn't quite convince myself that it was a bad move when I was playing over the board, and so anyway, it is what it is. It was a bit of an issue, and then the other issue was like in the end game somewhere. Let's see, like in these sorts of positions, not grabbing that a pawn when I could have. I think that would have made it I don't know about an easily winning endgame, but maybe an easily winning endgame for white if I had this outside pass pawn. So definitely some good things to learn from there. And it was a really good game. I'm quite proud of how strongly I played against a really strong opponent, and I am perfectly happy with a draw in this game. So that was round 2 of the Maritime Open. Stay tuned for the next rounds coming up. See you next time.